In 1904, while excavating the Oseberg ship, archaeologists found traces of grass and straw inside the ceremonial Viking footwear.
It was not decoration, it was thermal technology. If animal skins were their treasure, why would they entrust their winter survival to something so humble? Because this insulator outperformed the skins themselves, and almost no one remembers it today.
Chapter 1. The winter that nearly killed the Vikings. Winter descended upon Scandinavia like an ancient sentence, for during the Viking Age the North was not merely cold, it was a living frontier between human endurance and the forces of nature. In certain regions of Norway, temperatures dropped easily below 20 degrees below zero, while the wind sweeping in from the fjord struck the longhouses with a coarse roar that made the timber tremble. The winter darkness was not just the absence of light, it was a weight settling over the shoulders of every family, crushing their resolve and draining the stores of warmth they fought so hard to preserve. Thus the clans learned that the first battle of the year was not against an enemy of flesh and iron, but against the climate itself. Animal skins, symbols of power and survival, were not always enough. On the harshest nights, even wolf and bear pelts lost their ability to retain heat when the moisture from human breath soaked into them, for the water trapped in the fibers froze the moment it met the frigid air. Snow filtered in through invisible cracks, turning the interior of the houses into a space where every exhalation seemed like a small white specter. It was within this brutal setting that one of the least mentioned paradoxes of Norse history was born. Salvation did not always come from prestigious resources, but from the humblest materials available. To grasp the magnitude of this danger, one need only imagine an Icelandic longhouse in the middle of January. Smoke from the central hearth rises in thick, heavy coils and leaves a bitter smell in the air while the upper beams collect layers of soot. Children sleep pressed against their mothers. The household animals gather near the fire so they do not freeze to death. The survival of the entire community depends on the longhouse's ability to retain every fragment of heat produced by the flames. And it is precisely here that archaeology offers a decisive revelation. Excavations at Borg in the Lofoten archipelago have revealed layers of straw and plant material used as insulation beneath sleeping platforms and under the floors, proving that the thermal structure of these dwellings was deliberate, complex, and surprisingly effective. The use of straw was never a simple, improvised gesture to add comfort. It was a learned strategy, transmitted and refined over generations because straw possessed a property that animal skins could never match. It trapped air inside even when it began to absorb moisture. That network of tiny cavities acted as an invisible barrier between the body and the frozen earth, preventing the sleeper's warmth from draining into the ground. Conduction was winter's quietest enemy, stealing heat without leaving visible traces. That is why the Vikings understood that lying directly on cold wood or compacted earth could be fatal. Thus straw, seemingly insignificant, became an essential ally. In the rural regions of Norway and Sweden, where winters were more severe, freshly harvested straw was spread over the sleeping platforms before being covered with coarse textiles. When a body rested on that vegetal layer, the natural moisture produced during the night was absorbed without cooling the skin, reducing heat loss. Chronicles from certain monasteries describing contact with Norse communities remark that visitors from the north appeared accustomed to sleeping in beds warmer and softer than those of the monks themselves, an observation that makes complete sense once one understands that Viking beds did not rely solely on blankets and pelts, but on well-engineered insulation systems. The threat of winter was so absolute that it shaped the most important decisions of every household. It determined when young people trained, when merchants traveled, and when warriors set out or returned. In many cases, the survival of an entire clan depended not on the strength of its men, but on the knowledge passed down by the women responsible for preparing the homes for the dark season. They knew how to place the straw to create a uniform base, when to replace it once it grew too damp, and how to combine it with layers of turf on the exterior walls to reinforce the thermal protection of the longhouse. Without this domestic expertise, the coldest days could become an irreversible sentence. Despite the harshness of the landscape, each winter offered a chance to learn. Elders told stories of seasons when ice formed over the rivers so thick that no one could hear the water beneath their feet. They remembered nights when the northern wind made the roofs vibrate as though some ancient creature paced above them. And they repeated a lesson everyone understood as a fundamental truth. One does not survive winter by confronting it, but by understanding it. That is why the clans invested so much effort in preparing their longhouses before the first snows arrived. reinforcing beds, repairing walls, renewing plant insulation. They did not do it for comfort, but because any mistake could cost lives. The paradox that astonishes the modern world is that the Vikings, despite their fierce reputation, depended deeply on fragile and silent materials to endure the cold. Straw, what many considered an agricultural leftover, was one of the invisible pillars of Norse culture. In the cruelest years, when the sun vanished from the horizon for weeks, it was that simple vegetal layer that kept people alive as they slept in the dim interior of their homes. Thanks to it, a clan could retain warmth for hours, even when the outside cold seemed powerful enough to pierce the skin. And yet, behind this apparent simplicity lies an unsettling question. If straw offered such a clear thermal advantage, how did the Vikings discover its true potential, and why did they trust it even more than their most prized skins? The answer leads us into the very heart of their everyday ingenuity, where natural knowledge, intertwined with necessity.
But how did such a humble material become the thermal foundation of an entire northern civilization?
Chapter 2. The Ancestral Science, Why Straw Saved Lives. To understand how something as humble as straw became a vital resource for the Vikings, we must pause and consider what the cold destroys most swiftly: human warmth. Every body produces a steady amount of thermal energy, but the Nordic winter acted like an invisible predator that stole that energy without rest. For this reason, the true battle was never about generating heat, but about preventing its escape. And here begins the ancestral logic the clans mastered long before modern science could describe it. The key was air. Not the wind that battered the walls of the longhouses, but trapped air, motionless, safeguarding body heat. Straw naturally possessed a hollow, rigid structure that prevented collapse even as it absorbed moisture. Each stem functioned as a tiny pillar supporting inner spaces where air remained enclosed. That still air was a treasure because cold spreads far more quickly through solids and liquids, while unmoving air resists the transfer of heat. In this way, the Vikings understood, perhaps without naming it, that straw was not merely dried vegetation, but a microscopic architecture of thermal resistance. Archaeology supports this intuition. At the site of Borg, in the Lofoten Islands, researchers uncovered sleeping platforms made from successive layers of straw placed beneath woven fabrics. This pattern reveals a consistent practice, one that also appears in settlements of western Norway and later in Icelandic dwellings. Excavations at the Longhouse of Stöng in Iceland show that floors were reinforced with plant materials to keep moisture from rising up through the frozen ground. All of this points to a deep understanding of the relationship between humidity, cold, and heat loss. If a modern traveler could step into the life of a Viking, they would quickly discover that straw did far more than improve sleep. When a warrior or farmer walked on hardened snow, the temperature of the ground pulled heat from their feet at a dangerous speed. Soft leather footwear offered some flexibility but soaked easily and stiffened when frozen. To counter this, the Vikings filled their boots with dry grass, a habit documented in both Norway and Greenland. This was no casual improvisation. The grass absorbed the sweat's moisture before it could freeze, and at the same time, trapped pockets of air that shielded the skin from direct cold. The principle is the same one that allows Arctic animals to survive lethal temperatures. Modern thermal conductivity science confirms this effectiveness. A body lying directly on frozen ground loses heat continuously through contact. The earth becomes a massive thermal sink. But when a thick layer of straw is placed beneath the sleeper, the points of contact diminish and the trapped air slows conduction. The practical difference could mean waking up alive, or not waking up at all. Sagas and chronicles recount winters when snow rose to chest, height and rivers froze solid. It is no coincidence that in such conditions straw was treated as an essential resource, more valuable than many trade goods during the months of darkness. Experience also taught the Vikings that straw worked even when other materials failed. Skins retained warmth only as long as they remained dry, but absorbed moisture rapidly. A wet pelt lost its insulating power and became a frigid trap. Straw, however, maintained part of its structure even when damp. It was not perfect, but it resisted collapse and continued to trap air. In the longhouse, this meant that a freshly changed layer of straw could offer dependable protection for hours, even when the interior air was saturated with vapor from breathing bodies. For this reason, the clans enforced a rigorous cycle of straw renewal. They inspected it for excess moisture, removed old layers, and added new ones before the insulating capacity was compromised. Preparing for winter did not end with stocking food and repairing tools. It also required gathering sufficient straw to guarantee everyone's survival. The safety of children, elders, and livestock rested on this practical knowledge passed quietly between generations. Finds associated with the Oseberg ship reinforced this understanding. Inside the ceremonial footwear recovered from the burial, archaeologists identified fragments of dried grass, suggesting that even ritual objects followed this ancestral thermal logic. This indicates that the technique was not an improvised solution for extreme situations, but an ingrained element of Norse culture. They may not have written treatises on insulation, yet their ability to control the indoor climate of their homes reveals an adaptive intelligence that still surprises researchers. In essence, straw did more than retain heat. It regulated moisture, cushioned sleeping surfaces, and prevented the body from cooling under continuous pressure against rigid materials. Each of these functions responded to a single principle: preserving life in an environment where temperatures could plunge without warning, and thus a material many viewed as agricultural waste became a survival system, so effective it endured for centuries. But the most intriguing question remains: how did the Vikings apply this knowledge beyond their homes during explorations, trade journeys, and military campaigns when the cold grew even more unforgiving?
What thermal techniques did the Vikings rely on when they ventured far from the safety of the longhouse?
Chapter 3: Boots, Beds, and Walls: The Thermal Engineering of the North. To understand how deeply Viking survival depended on plant materials, we must descend into the places where the cold attacked with the greatest persistence: the feet, the resting spaces, and the walls exposed to the wind. It is in these everyday details that a quiet form of engineering is revealed, one that supported an entire civilization. It is not the heroic image of the warrior described in the sagas, but the practical knowledge that kept alive those who returned from journeys or endured the long months of darkness. Let us begin with the feet, for in them the endurance of the entire body was decided. Viking boots, made from soft leather stitched with techniques that allowed some flexibility, offered limited protection against extreme cold. Leather was permeable and yielded easily to moisture, meaning that every step on wet snow drained heat with alarming speed. Yet the Vikings never relied on leather alone. They filled their boots with dry grass, a custom documented in Norwegian communities even many centuries later. This grass, sometimes known as swamp grass in certain regions, absorbed internal moisture before it could freeze and trapped pockets of air that formed a protective thermal barrier. When the grass became too wet, there was no lamentation. It was simply replaced. It was a continuous, calculated cycle. Archaeological findings in Greenland confirm this practice. Boots recovered from Norse settlements preserve remnants of plant fibers inside them, a direct testimony to their thermal purpose. In western Norway, excavations in rural Viking Age dwellings show stores of dry grass kept near the entrances, evidence of frequent replenishment during winter. In this way, they solved a challenge that would have immobilized less prepared travelers, shielding the feet not with rare or costly materials, but with something accessible, renewable, and remarkably effective. If the feet were the first line of defense, the beds were the sacred refuge where the body regained its strength. Sleeping poorly during winter was not a minor discomfort, it was a risk of illness and weakness. For that reason, Viking beds were not merely wooden platforms covered with blankets. They were insulation systems built with compacted layers of straw. Straw acted as a thermal cushion, separating the body from the cold platform and holding in the heat produced during the night. Unlike wool, which could become saturated with moisture, straw resisted collapse and continued trapping air even in difficult conditions. Excavations at Borg reveal elevated sleeping platforms designed to prevent cold from rising through the floor. Beneath these platforms, archaeologists discovered remains of straw and plant fibers, confirming their function as insulating bases. Ethnographic studies in Iceland show that this practice endured for centuries after the Viking Age, because its effectiveness was undeniable. Moreover, straw cushioned the body, reducing pressure points and allowing more restorative sleep. The result was a combination of insulation, comfort, and moisture control that even some modern techniques struggle to replicate with such simplicity. But the greatest thermal achievement of the Vikings was found not only in boots or beds, but in the architecture of their homes. Longhouses were immense rectangular structures supported by wooden beams and covered with layers of turf and straw. These outer layers formed a vegetal skin that shielded the walls from the freezing wind. As turf dried and compacted, it created a protective shell that trapped air in multiple layers. The straw reinforcing the interior added lightness and elasticity. In this way, every wall became a natural insulation system of surprising effectiveness. Studies from the reconstruction of the Lofotr Longhouse, based on findings from Borg, demonstrate that turf layers provided notable thermal regulation, keeping interior temperatures more stable even in the depths of winter. This entirely natural system transformed the Longhouse into a living organism adapted to the climate. It breathed, retained warmth, expelled moisture, and distributed the heat rising from the central hearth. Straw acted as a thermal regulator, preventing cold air from settling in corners and contributing to a habitable indoor environment. To a modern visitor standing inside a reconstructed longhouse, the insulation might seem accidental, simply a byproduct of the available materials. But the evidence contradicts such assumptions. Every layer of turf and straw was placed with intention because every centimeter mattered. The clans could not afford to rely on chance to survive the winter. That is why they gathered straw after the harvest and stored it as a strategic resource, not as agricultural waste. Straw was also used to reinforce interior walls, fill gaps, and create barriers against drafts. When the wind struck the exterior of the longhouse, its force dispersed across the outer layers, while the interior maintained a steadier temperature. The combination of turf and straw was so effective that many rural Scandinavian buildings continued using variations of this technique into the modern era. This silent engineering explains why the Vikings could withstand winters that might have defeated other peoples. Their understanding of insulation did not come from written theories, but from observation, necessity, and generational transmission. Straw was not a minor detail. It was the invisible foundation that sustained life. Yet an essential question remains. How did the Vikings apply these techniques when they were far from home? On trade routes, exploration journeys, or military campaigns, where the cold became even more ruthless.
What thermal strategies did the Vikings use during their travels to avoid freezing far from their longhouse?
Chapter 4. Journeys, Exploration, and War. Insulation far from home. When the Vikings left the safety of their longhouse, they entered a world where the cold did not forgive mistakes. The sea, the forests, and the mountains seemed to multiply winter's severity. Every expedition, whether for trade, war, or exploration, became a constant test of thermal adaptation. What is surprising is that the very same principles that protected the clans inside their homes allowed them to survive during the most dangerous journeys. Straw, dry grass, and other plant materials accompanied travelers just as faithfully as weapons and food. On their ships, Vikings slept on layers of plant material that separated their bodies from the cold hull. Findings associated with funerary vessels such as Oseberg confirm the presence of vegetal fibers placed beneath fabrics and blankets, suggesting a long-established tradition. No traveler was meant to rest on bare wood. The cold of the sea climbed up through the hull like a silent creature eager to drain warmth. To prevent this, they laid straw or dry grass beneath their bodies, knowing that even a thin layer could mean the difference between waking with pain or not waking at all. During land expeditions, the Vikings applied similar knowledge. When the group had to stop and spend the night, the first task was assessing the ground. They sought slightly elevated areas to avoid moisture seeping upward into their improvised beds. There, they spread a thick layer of spruce branches as structural support, and over them placed dry grass or straw when available. The combination of branches and plant fibers formed a mattress that retained body heat while reducing direct contact with the frozen earth. This technique, documented in later rural Nordic communities, almost certainly has roots older than the Viking Age itself. Wind presented another relentless enemy. In coastal or mountainous regions, its force could magnify the cold to unbearable levels. To protect themselves, the Vikings built windbreaks with thick branches and animal hides, always adding plant layers between the structures. The reason was simple. Wind does more than chill. It strips moisture from the body, accelerating heat loss. Straw, with its internal lattice of air chambers, slowed this loss and acted as a natural wall against humidity. On the most merciless nights, they even stuffed dry grass between rocks to form makeshift shelters. In dense forests, where snow sometimes piled high enough to cover the trunks of young trees, the Vikings used a resource known through generations, the hollowed spaces formed beneath low branches of fir or pine. These cavities, partly shielded from the wind and lined naturally with plant debris, provided the beginnings of a shelter. Travelers cleared away the top layer of snow and reinforced the interior with straw and branches, creating a warm pocket where body heat accumulated quickly. Entering such a space must have felt like crossing the threshold of a longhouse, the air dense, quiet, and surprisingly warm. During military campaigns, thermal protection became even more urgent. A warrior weakened by the cold was a danger to the group. Therefore, before an assault or during a prolonged siege, Vikings reinforced their clothing not only with furs, but also with layers of plant material tucked between inner garments. Some medieval chronicles describe warriors appearing bulkier in winter, leading some scholars to suspect they carried extra insulation. Although chroniclers were not always accurate, this idea aligns with practices well documented in Nordic rural life. When fur was not enough, dry grass filled the space between the skin and the fabric, trapping heat without hindering movement. Persistent moisture posed yet another challenge. Frozen rivers, melting snow, and storms could soak clothing easily. Unlike wool, which retains some insulating ability, even when wet, leather turned into a sheet of ice when saturated. For this reason, before sleep or long marches, many travelers dismantled the day's plant insulation and replaced it with fresh material. This practice may seem laborious, but it was a refined survival strategy. Wet grass was dried near the fire and reused later, while fresh grass provided immediate insulation. In Greenland, where temperatures could drop even lower than in Norway, Norse settlers perfected these techniques. Excavations at Brattahlid and Gardar reveal traces of dry grass and plant fibers inside garments and footwear. The need for extreme insulation pushed settlers to develop combinations of straw, turf, and wool, arranged in multiple layers. The Arctic wind allowed no mistakes. Every layer mattered. Every fiber held a fragment of warmth. What is most fascinating is how these ancestral technologies followed the Vikings everywhere, from trade routes in the east to exploration voyages in the west. Whether navigating ice-covered seas or crossing damp, shadowed forests, they carried with them the certainty that nature itself provided the tools for survival, if one understood how to use them. Yet an even deeper story remains to be told. Why did these highly effective, widely used techniques disappear from collective memory while other elements of Viking culture survived through legends and chronicles?
How could a technology that sustained Viking life for centuries almost vanish from history?
Chapter 5. The Invisible Legacy. Why this ancestral technology was forgotten. The story of straw as a Viking insulator does not end in the home, on the ships, or in the camps. It ends in silence. Because unlike swords, amulets, ships, or sagas, this everyday technology is almost never mentioned in later accounts. It was as essential to Norse survival as iron or fishing, and yet its memory faded over time. Understanding why this happened means understanding something deeper than simple forgetfulness. It means recognizing how humanity chooses what to remember and what to consign to the shadows. For the Vikings, straw held no symbolic prestige. It was not a material that conferred honor, nor an object worthy of adorning a grave. Straw decayed, vanished, and returned to the earth without leaving a visible trace. Archaeological excavations at Borg, Oseberg, and the Greenland settlements reveal its presence only in fragile fragments, scattered fibers, compacted traces, and faint residues that must be reconstructed with patience. There were no poems dedicated to it, no tales celebrating its importance. But this silence does not reflect a lack of value. It is powerful evidence of something else. The survival of a society is often held up by the very things that go unspoken. While other aspects of Viking culture rose into popular mythology, straw remained in the domain of the domestic and the unseen. Battles were remembered, voyages celebrated, metal artifacts preserved. Straw, by contrast, was replaced, burnt, discarded, or simply left to decompose when its work was done. That is why modern archaeology has had to recover its role from minimal clues. Vegetal remains adhered to ritual footwear, compacted fragments in longhouse floors, deposits tucked into wall crevices. Each tiny remnant reveals a larger truth. Without these materials, the clans would have succumbed to the northern winters. Cultural transformation also contributed to its disappearance. With the arrival of Christianity and the gradual integration of Scandinavian territories into European trade networks, the perception of comfort shifted. New textile materials, new building techniques, and new beliefs took hold. Straw continued to be used in rural areas, but it lost its strategic role. Its status as a fundamental insulator faded beneath the arrival of finer wools, improved fabrics, and different architectural structures. Collective memory, shaped by the desire for innovation, left behind what seemed too ordinary to remember. At the same time, the modern image of the Vikings, built largely from medieval chronicles written by outside cultures, ignored domestic life almost completely. Those texts focused on raids, voyages, religious conversions, not on the methods that allowed people to sleep warmly during a storm. In this selective storytelling lies the root of the erasure. The deeds were remembered, the caretaking was forgotten, and so the thermal knowledge that had sustained the clans for centuries became a faint echo, preserved only in what archaeologists recovered from the soil. Yet modern science offers a new lens through which to understand all this. By studying how straw functions as insulation, we realize that the Vikings mastered, without written theories, principles now considered fundamental: conduction, convection, relative humidity, and heat conservation. They knew that still air was their greatest ally. They knew that moisture was a silent enemy. They knew they could not sleep on cold wood without a vegetal barrier between body and ground. They did not call it science, but they practiced it with the precision of experience. This recognition adds an emotional depth to the story. It is not simply about explaining how the Vikings survived, but about observing what this reveals about human nature. We tend to remember what shines, what impresses, what rises above the rest. But we forget the simple solutions that quietly sustain daily life. Straw did not win battles, nor dazzle poets, nor inspire ambition. Its role was humbler and far more decisive, preserving warmth when winter turned the world into a motionless expanse of ice. And perhaps that is why it was forgotten. Straw worked so naturally, so effectively, that no one thought to record it. It was knowledge passed from mothers to daughters, from elders to youth, without the need for runestones or parchment. It was part of the cultural fabric, so deeply woven into life that it was invisible. The problem is that what remains invisible eventually fades if no one names it. This is why, when archaeologists found grass inside the Oseberg burial footwear, the initial interpretation was uncertain. It could not be decoration, nor did it hold obvious ritual meaning. Only with later studies did scholars understand that it reflected a thermal technique used across generations. This small discovery opened a window onto a world of forgotten methods, revealing that Viking greatness rested not only in strength or ferocity, but also in their capacity for adaptation. The question that now emerges is unavoidable. If such an effective, widespread, and vital technology could vanish almost entirely, what other ancestral solutions remain hidden, waiting to be rediscovered? What practical knowledge was lost not because it failed, but because it stopped seeming extraordinary?
The story of straw is not merely a forgotten chapter of the Viking Age. It is a powerful reminder that human survival depends as much on memory as on innovation. And
the warm echo of a forgotten technology. When we look at the fragments of straw found at Borg, the traces of grass inside the Oseberg footwear, or the vegetal residues in Greenlandic Norse settlements, we understand that we are not facing mere debris from the past. We are witnessing the remains of a silent intelligence, a form of wisdom that did not require writing to sustain life in a relentless environment. Every excavated fiber is proof that the Vikings survived not only through strength, but through a deep relationship with the humblest materials of their world. In this journey, we have followed the trail of an insulator that outperformed skins, accompanied sailors, warriors, and entire families, and kept longhouses warm while the world outside sank into winter darkness. Straw seemed insignificant, but within it lay an ancestral answer to the cold, a solution so effective that the clans integrated it into every aspect of life without needing to mention it in their sagas. The true legacy of this story lies not only in the technique itself, but in what it reveals. Sometimes the most valuable knowledge is transmitted quietly, adapts over time, disappears from written memory, yet remains in the earth, in objects, in the lingering echo of a life once shaped by it. To understand the Viking world, we must look beyond swords and ships. We must pay attention to what does not shine, what is not celebrated, what dissolves in rain and blends with dust. There, in those invisible details, lies the real story of their resilience.
If you wish to discover more about how the Vikings transformed simple materials into tools of survival, exploration, and power,
the North still holds secrets, waiting to be brought back into the light.